November 5th is Election Day here in the Commonwealth. And of course, the biggest question of them all is who will be the next president of the United States? But if you live in Massachusetts, there are a lot of other things that are going to be on the ballot that need to be considered when you get to the polls. So joining me today is political correspondent here at NBC 10 Boston, analyst, correspondent, commentator, you name it.
Rambler.
All of it.
All those.
You do it all very well. And I'm Kwani Lunis, by the way, should introduce myself. But you're going to basically explain to our viewers why they need to be at the polls and why they need to actually take those questions seriously.
Correct. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, the first question is, why are ballot questions so important?
Right. So ballot questions are important because they address issues that people care about that the legislators, the state lawmakers may not be dealing with. And why do we have them? Well, they celebrated their 100th anniversary here in the Commonwealth.
A casual milestone.
Yep. 1918, we had the first amendment added to our Constitution saying that people could do direct access. They could say, listen, state lawmaker, I don't think you're doing what we need you to do. Here's an issue that I care about that I want you to consider making into law. So it's a direct action sort of thing. It represents a whole movement that was happening in the United States in the early 1900s. And it's any citizen, you, me, anyone, can say, I want this to be considered. Of course, there's a process for it. You just don't walk up and say, put it on the list.
Right.
You have to collect signatures. You have to write the question. You have to present it to the Attorney General to make sure that it's constitutionally correct. Like, you just can't make stuff up. So the Constitution actually has to apply to the questions. And then if it passes, if it gets on the ballot and it passes, it isn't necessarily immediately binding. So the lawmakers can take a long time to put it into law. They can drag their feet. Citizens can take other action. So it's a process that originally was put in place to give direct power to citizens. Of course, over the years, sometimes constituencies, lobbyists, companies, people and groups with self-serving interests have co-opted it. And so when you're voting on these questions, it's important to wonder who put it forward, why did they put it forward? That doesn't mean it's not valid. It doesn't mean that we may not want it, but just to educate yourself as to who put it on the ballot and what they want.
Agenda necessarily is. And to your point, it is definitely an added benefit to our democracy for people to have that opportunity to really make their voices heard when it comes to issues that are very important to our community. So you mentioned a little bit of how a question gets to the ballot. What is that process specifically?
So what happens is the people or the group put forward a petition with a small number of signatures on it. And then if it gets approved, the language gets approved, then they have to go out, and I think they collect 74,574 signatures on a petition.
Is there significance to that number?
I don't know, actually. That's a very good question. I bet it's a percentage of the population, I'm going to guess.
That makes sense.
So, if you're out shopping sometimes in the spring and someone comes up to you and says, hey, do you care about blah, 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 would you sign this petition to get it on the ballot? So that way the lawmakers and the voters aren't just considering, again, some crackpot idea that somebody has. And a lot of people sign the petitions, whether they agree with the question or not, because they want people to have access to vote on it. And then it goes on the ballot when we get into our general election. The challenge with the ballot questions for folks is that since it's not on the primary ballot, which happens in September, it's really a quick run-up. So people start paying attention in September. The numbers of the questions don't necessarily get assigned quickly, and then you only have a couple of months to learn about them. Plus, sometimes the yes on no, why, yes, 2, 3, 4.
And all you see are ads specifically saying those things, again, pushing those agendas.
Right, and the yes doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it.
Right, exactly.
So it's a complicated
they word
thing.
it specific.
Yes.
And that's the reason why we're doing this segment, is to kind of break down that entire process. And we'll actually be reading the questions verbatim so that when you get to the polls, you're not quickly Googling on your phone, like, what exactly did any of this mean?
Yeah, I mean, I have always considered myself a high information voter and a smart person. And there have been times when I was just a regular person when I wasn't prepared.
You were just a regular person.
And I remember walking into to a ballot and seeing the questions and going like, what does this even mean? I was like so confused.
Yeah, the wording is definitely a big factor in that. Here in the Commonwealth, are there any famous ballot questions that stand out to you?
There are indeed. There's a lot of famous. Some of the most successful ones. This is an oldie but a goodie. 1980, question 2 on Proposition 2.5. That was a question that cap the percentage of tax revenue that a municipality can generate from property tax. So it was a cap on property taxes. It gets referenced a lot whenever there's tax discussion on Beacon Hill.
I imagine that was good for residents here.
Well, it was good. Again, it's one of those things. If you think that you should be able to raise more taxes in order to pay for stuff, or if you think there should be a cap on how much your property, because sometimes you don't make a lot of money, but your property starts to be more valuable.
Right.
So it's a double-edged sword. You might remember this one from 2016, question 4, legalization and regulation and taxation of marijuana.
I heard about it.
So that was an issue where
A big one, too.
over and over people were saying, we think marijuana should be decriminalized. We think marijuana should be legalized. Lawmakers were doing nothing about it. So these folks, of course, there was a big group behind them, but the reason we have legalized marijuana now is because of a ballot question. Another one, when 2018, question 3, the Mass Gender Identity Anti-Discrimination Initiative, that was the first statewide anti-discrimination law that protected trans rights. That was a big deal.
Yep.
It also shows, and this is, I think you'll appreciate, that year, Republican Governor Charlie Baker was overwhelmingly reelected, and a lot of the same people who voted for a Republican voted to pass trans discrimination protections. So that's sometimes when you wonder,
What exactly is the state politically?
right, splitting the ballot,
Yeah.
what people are thinking. We don't fit into boxes, and the ballot questions are a good way to look
show
at that.
that, yeah.
And then we had question 9 in 1994 to prohibit the repeal of rent control. That was controversial. 2012, question 2, which failed, the death with dignity. Allowing folks to choose euthanasia under certain circumstances. And, of course, charter schools, which come up a lot, 2016, that failed 32 to 68%.
Wow.
So there's a lot of them, and some of them we have forgotten about. But it is, again, your chance to directly participate in telling the lawmakers what you think, even if it doesn't pass.
And to your point, those questions, the answers, the votes end up having a legacy, sometimes lasting a long time.
Yes.
Specifically in your state. So it really is one of those situations where you have to step outside of yourself and understand that democracy also includes us making decisions for the people that are coming after us.
Absolutely.
So let's get into the questions because that's why most people are here. So question number 1 on the ballot, and again, I wanted to specifically read them in a way that when you get to the polls, you're not questioning everything all over again.
Right. Can I just say, too?
Absolutely.
Make notes and bring the note
Yes.
with you. Don't.
Yes.
And I mean this sincerely. I have to do this on the questions as well because I get confused. So whatever you believe you want to pass or don't pass, write it on a note and bring it with you if you're going in person to vote or if you're voting early.
That's a really good piece of advice. Yeah, I like
Write
that.
it down on your phone. Or,
Exactly.
you know.
It's not a trick question. You're allowed to bring notes.
Right. So it's not a test.
Right, exactly. All right, the first question on the ballot. Do you approve of a law summarized below on which no vote was taken by the Senate or the House of Representatives before May 1st of 2024? And the title of that is State Auditor's Authority to Audit the Legislature. Off the cuff, I'm pretty sure half of our audience is like, what exactly does that mean?
Right, and this is a
So what
great
does it mean?
example. So my friend and co-anchor of At Issue on Sundays at 11:30 right here on NBC 10
Shameless
Boston,
plug.
Corey Smith has helped put this together. So he's very thorough and more thorough than me.
Appreciate
But
you, Corey.
This is a great example of, you think you might have heard about the auditor, Diana DiZoglio, who is asking to audit the legislature. But then you go in and you see that question, and you're like, is that the auditor question? I have no idea. This is the auditor question. So in English, or in simple language, should the auditor oversee the legislature? Should the office's investigative powers expand to include the oversight of the legislature? Okay? So this, again, being led by Massachusetts State Auditor Diane DiZoglio. She campaigned on this issue. She wants to be able to investigate state lawmakers overseeing and evaluating some of their activities. And at the moment, there are no examples that we could find of legislative audits being conducted without the lawmaker's consent. So she's saying, I want to come in and audit you. The lawmakers are saying, we audit ourselves. There's nobody else who does this. Supporters who believe that she should be able to do this say that it would give us more accountability and transparency into how the lawmakers are acting. This state, Massachusetts, this Commonwealth, is one of the worst when it comes to transparency. Florida beats us when it comes to transparency. Okay. So the idea of wanting to be able to see what lawmakers are doing and access to records is part of what's driving this. What the opponents say is that the legislators are opposed to the state auditor getting more power, expanding the power of the audit. And the Senate President, Karen Spilka, says that it's redundant. It already happens. They already have oversight. So what would happen if this law passes? If question 1 passes, if you vote yes on question 1, it would make some legislative activities subject to audit, like employee training rules, cybersecurity, ways that cybersecurity works, how they purchase things, what things they buy. But what it would not do is it will not give the auditor power to examine votes, debates, assignment of policies, and legislators will also have a lot of leverage to resist these investigations or these audits into them. So a lot of folks are saying it's a question that really doesn't accomplish a lot, and that's something to consider. Do your own investigation on it and see what you want to do. But, why? Who's backing it? Why does it happen? What would happen? So, like it says, it would make no change to state law.
Thank you for breaking that down. And I want to also add a quick reference. If you do want to go online, definitely go to the state website and look at the breakdown. Obviously, Sue's breaking it down for us as well, but it does have a little more insight as to what the proposals were on both sides.
Yeah, you don't have to take my word for it.
Exactly.
You can absolutely
Again, that's what we mean when we talk about informed voters.
Yes.
Obviously, we're bringing information, but there's still a little more extra homework that needs to be done. So question number 2 is the MCAS. And I actually was inspired to do this because of that question, specifically because it focuses on education here, but more specifically the standardized testing. And that has been a conversation for years, not even just in Massachusetts, about whether or not standardized testing should be a metric when it comes to the way that students perform and the way we evaluate whether or not they're worthy of graduation. So question 2, as written, elimination of MCAS as a high school graduation requirement. Do you approve of a law summarized below on which no vote was taken by the Senate or the House of Representatives before May 1st, 2024? As required by law, summaries are written by the Attorney General. This law proposed would eliminate the requirement that a student passes the Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, which is an MCAS test, or other statewide or district-wide assessments in mathematics, science, and technology, and English in order to receive a high school diploma. What say you, Sue O'Connell? Not their answer. Just how do you explain that to us?
So, one conversation that we've been having, too, is like, well, why would you care about MCAS if you don't have kids?
Yeah,
right?
That was literally my first question, and so I am very intrigued now.
Yeah, so I would say you should care about the MCAS generally, and should care about education and public education generally. Look, I'm 62. Everybody I work with right now is at least 20 years younger than me and was in elementary school when I, started like my 3rd career.
Which means it affects you because you are now working with people.
You.
Exactly.
So I want my coworkers. I want coworkers to be informed and smart. You want the people of your state, of your country, to be smart and be educated. Yeah. So that's just sort of the baseline. You should care about education.
Again, this is for a high school diploma, not for a college degree, just for the basic standard of education here in the U.S.
And you want to care about equity. You want to care how it's applied. So those are things that you should consider anyway with equity, with education. Just my opinion. So here's the background of how this question got here. Public high school students, obviously, as we said, must meet graduation requirements to receive a competency determination to graduate. So that means that they know enough to graduate. And the way that we do this here in Massachusetts is giving the 10th grade MCAS exam. Supporters of eliminating the MCAS, they say it reduces the state's role as a gatekeeper in high school graduation. It empowers districts, teachers, communities to craft measures of student achievement. It frees teachers to focus less on teaching to the test. And special needs kids and special needs students, they often struggle with the MCAS, and this might help them. So basically, it gives the power, doesn't give power to the state over schools. It lets the school districts be in charge, and that's what the pitch is for the yes. For the no, opponents say it could make it hard to maintain educational standards across the state. So if you're in one school, say in Lawrence, and in another school in Wellesley, there might be different standards to graduate, and that might impact your ability to get a good job or to be able to do just about anything in the world, right? The requirement rarely prevents students from getting a diploma. So there are, I would say, of all the students in Massachusetts, only a handful don't graduate because they don't pass the MCAS. So opponents say, is this fixing a problem that doesn't exist? And in any given year, there are several hundred exceptions. So less than 1% of high school students, high school seniors, are given an exception. So, again, this is a complicated issue. It also might reflect how you feel about standardized tests, but it will have a major impact on our schools if it's passed or if it isn't passed. So if it's passed, students would still need to take the 10th grade MCAS, but would no longer need to earn a passing score or other state approval. Districts would set their own criteria for graduation. It would make Massachusetts one of the few states without a common graduation standard, and it would lead to separate educational expectations in the 300-plus school districts in Massachusetts. So every school district, all 300 of them, would determine their own reason to graduate, standards to graduate.
It gets more complex because the first thing that comes to mind for me, the point that you mentioned, is that does this create some form of education equity in the state? And I can't say whether or not it does, but that, I think, kind of prompts it, again, not only for people that are in school, but for parents and, of course, people that we will eventually be working with in different fields and industries here in Massachusetts.
Yep. So there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of opinion on this, and then I would just urge people to try and, read both sides.
Absolutely.
So that you understand where folks are coming from and what the implication is.
Again, if you don't have kids, it still affects you.
Still important.
That's the message here.
Because I'm working with somebody who was in elementary school.
I'm honored. All right, next question. Number 3, the unionization for transportation network drivers. The question is, the proposed law would provide transportation network drivers with the right to form unions to collectively bargain with transportation network companies, which are companies that use a digital network to connect riders, think ride shares, and they would connect them with the prearranged transportation to create negotiated recommendations concerning wages, benefits, terms and conditions for the workers themselves.
Right. So question 3, should Lyft and Uber drivers...
They basically kept out the names for, I guess, for PR purposes.
Should Lyft and Uber drivers be able to unionize? That's basically the question. So the background on this, it covers drivers who use the platforms like Uber and Lyft, but not gig drivers who drive for food delivery. Okay,
like long haul truck drivers and such.
No, just
all like the DoorDash and
right.
Okay.
The unionizing efforts, of course, face an uphill battle. In 2015, there was an effort in Seattle, I think, that lost. Here's some inside baseball words. Sector-based bargaining is largely untested in the U.S. and likely to face legal challenges. Sector-based means just what you do. Right, so if you are a
unions within
rideshare
drivers,
you get a union.
Okay.
So there's a lot of legal challenges.
See, if you word it that way, you automatically intimidate someone that
what the
needs
heck
to vote
is that
on it.
sector? Yeah, who knows? And the number to create a union is very low. Only 12.5% of the folks need to unionize. So that's sort of the background as to why this was moved forward. It's hard to get unionized protection if you're in a sector that doesn't.
Have it
right
generally,
and it's tough. Even though we talk a lot about unions in this country, unions are having a difficult time getting people to join, and a lot of companies are really making it difficult for unions to be successful. There's been stuff in the news about Amazon and Starbucks, so that's the background. The opponents of this question say that it would likely cost the rides. It would make the cost of rides using Lyft and Uber go up, and that means that people
Uber
would
suffers in
use
some
it
way.
less.
Yeah,
Right.
Right.
So
And then
if-
does that crash the market itself?
Right. So does it hurt more than helps? Because if people are using it less, do the drivers end up making less money? It also would limit some benefits of the apps, if you're using it less. Let's face it, lots of people are drinking more when they go out if they don't have to drive. So would they end up not using the app and driving drunk? Supporters say, listen, it improves the welfare of the drivers, right? The gig economy, especially with Uber and Lyft, would it limit the number of hours that they would make? Would it give them a guarantee of a certain income? So it might be more helpful to the drivers. So what would happen if it's passed? If there's a yes on question 3, it would allow for sector-based bargaining. Drivers across these multiple companies could negotiate together for better pay, expanded benefits, and the other protections which would apply across the industry. If you vote no, nothing happens.
Nothing changes. And whether it's for the better or the worse of the drivers, that is to be determined as well. And again, the consumer,
Right.
us, the people that use those services.
And I'll say, both sides will have drivers saying, I like it, I don't
And
like
that's
it.
the complicated part.
So you need to just go in and do some education.
research.
Do your research.
All right, next question. Question number 4, as summarized, is the proposed law that would allow persons aged 21 and older to grow, possess, and use certain natural psychedelic substances in certain circumstances. The psychedelic substances allowed would be 2 substances found in mushroom and 3 substances found in plants. Basically, the shrooms conversation in layman's terms.
Shrooms.
Which we were talking about marijuana being passed here in Massachusetts. So this is an added level. There has been a decriminalization of psychedelics on the West Coast. And now that's clearly coming throughout the country with these questions. Do you know how this one was specifically put on the ballot here?
Yes. So question 4, legalizing psychedelic drugs, the shrooms, just to make sure it's clear. Should Massachusetts legalize some psychedelics and set rules for therapeutic personal use? That's the question.
And that's why they wrote specific certain circumstances.
Right.
I think is a very key factor.
Yeah, it's
in
not
this.
just
You run into the
Right.
psychedelic dispensary and grab
a bag. And,
right.
Yeah.
Handing them out.
We might be on them now. Who knows? Could be. I don't know. The background on this, as you asked, Kwani, is the psychedelic drugs obviously are being used widely in clinical research for mental health, for self-care. Many drugs, like we learned with marijuana, were kept from being researched because they were criminalized, right? Where a lot of the medicines we take
Had some form of that
come
drug.
from, because it was viewed as recreational and bad. It was not investigated, right? So it's this weird double standard that we have. So that was what's pushing this. It does show, some early studies show that one of the ingredients could help with mental health conditions. And the ballot question here would allow some therapy centers to allow more of the types of drugs to be offered. You know that ketamine is being offered in some, this isn't in that category,
Exactly, yeah.
but that used to be a drug that was for vets, trauma, and in a nightclub illegally, recreationally, and now it's being used for mental health help. So what opponents say, why do people want you to vote no on question 4? They say that psychedelics associated with some real harm. People have been harmed by psychedelics. They say that the drugs can trigger a significant adverse reaction, especially if you have mental health issues or if you've never participated in doing drugs like this before after you reach a certain age, and that the treatment at these treatment centers would be very expensive, and therefore they think that the treatment centers being expensive might make you use them at home without proper supervision. The people who are, saying, let's do it, are saying that it could help folks with mental health questions. So if it's passed, it would allow a group of naturally occurring psychedelic drugs like DMT, mescaline, to be grown, shared, used at home, and offered by a licensed professional in a more clinical setting. They would not be available to be purchased at a retail shop like cannabis is today, and adults would need to grow their own, find someone willing to share, or use a licensed therapy center.
So my question to that is not only how do you regulate who's growing it at home and how do you determine whether or not they should be approved to, but also people, I imagine people probably are already growing it at home, obviously illegally,
Yep.
but if they start growing it now, then who is going to be checking in to make sure that not everyone and their cousin is just throwing some in the backyard?
Yeah, I mean, it's still the sort of it mirrors the cannabis situation. Where there are rules about growing it at home. No one is coming knocking on your door to make sure you're doing
Excuse me, man, we're looking for plants.
Right, we're looking for your plants, so making sure your brownies are labeled correctly and wherever they're supposed to be and away from kids.
Which they probably should, honestly.
Right. So that enforcement issue is a question of it, but the reality is, if this passes, it will also take about as long as it took the marijuana to be in cannabis industry to get launched, or this isn't an industry so much, but that it would be pushed forward.
I imagine this would be a stepping stone for an eventual regulation of it being accessible the way that marijuana is.
I don't know.
No,
we'd see.
That's true. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, again, these are also, even though these substances have been around since the dawn of time, we don't have a lot of study and research, and we need the data. Remember, the cannabis in Massachusetts, we didn't have any data. We just knew how our friends acted, right? And so now we're a few years in, and we're seeing data on how cannabis and marijuana are impacting people or not impacting people, and then they can make decisions. So one of the things about the point you make, passing laws like this, we don't do the research first. We just kind of pass the laws, and then we try and catch up.
Where we go with it. And that
Right.
in itself, it sounds like that's the research of us just letting people do it.
Right, but if the lawmakers actually did their job and actually would do some of the research on things that people are caring about, this is actually something people care about, we might not need a ballot question for it, and we might get a more informed law. The problem is our state lawmakers are often voted one of the least effectual, most ineffectual lawmakers in the country. They pass the fewest laws. We regularly miss our budget deadline. So if lawmakers actually worked harder at passing or examining legislation like this or proposing legislation like this, we might have more sound laws.
Especially in a state like where
That's my rant.
That's the rant. That's the soapbox. But we're in a state where there is we have all of these at universities where the research can be done in tandem with the state, but it doesn't seem as though that's a thing.
Right. If people care enough to put this on the ballot, you would think that the lawmakers would care enough to investigate.
Yeah.
Just thinking, me spitballing
Right,
here.
casual.
Not a lawmaker, just wondering.
All right, question 5. All of these have been very spicy because they have been big conversations started. We were actually in the break room here, which is how this fully came about. But question
Eating
5.
bread. We were eating bread.
Eating bread. And bread brings people together for sure. So this question, I've heard a lot from people in Boston about it specifically. I've seen signs everywhere. The tipping question. So minimum wage for tipped workers. The proposed law would gradually increase the minimum hourly wage an employer must pay a tipped worker over the course of 5 years on a following schedule to 64% of the state minimum wage on January 1st of 2025. The next year, it would be 73% of the state minimum wage. In 2027, it would be 82% of the state minimum wage. And by 2028 and 29, it would have jumped from 91 to fully 100% of the state minimum wage here in the state of Massachusetts. The proposed law would require employees to continue to pay the tip workers the difference between that minimum wage and the total amount a tip worker receives in hourly wages plus tips through the end of, well, eventually, again, 2029.
Yeah.
So again, breaking it down, it doesn't seem simple off the top, but again, this one's very controversial in the sense of how it affects the people that when we go out to eat. They're the ones that are affected by this.
Right, with our crazy tip culture here in the United States of
Americans.
America. So question 5, should the $6.75 per hour tip minimum wage be phased out and employers required to cover the full minimum wage of tip workers by 2029? Okay, so here's the background. Minimum wage laws, of course, are all over the place for waitstaff and bartenders and manicurists and all
Everywhere,
sorts of
honestly.
tip workers. Tip workers are guaranteed the full minimum wage, $15 an hour, but employers can pay them as little as $6.75 per hour as long as the tips make up the difference. So they're getting minimum wage now, but it's a mix of either the employer or the employer and a mix of employer and tips, or the employer makes up the difference. Okay. So what supporters say, who are saying yes, vote yes on question 5, that if you eliminate the tipped minimum wage, it would likely increase earnings for workers. Allowing tips to be shared with kitchen staff could help equalize the pay between the front and the back of the house workers.
Sometimes you see that already with the appreciation fee, kitchen appreciation fee on your
back
receipt.
of the house fee
Exactly.
or service fee that's added on. What opponents say is that some servers actually like the system the way it is. A bartender who is in a bar, not a restaurant, and is working really hard to take care of her customers may not want to share her tips equally with people who are in the back of the house because it's a different setup. Restaurants and other tip-dependent businesses say they will face higher costs from having to cover the minimum wage as a guarantee there, and they would likely, they say, lead to a mix of price increases and new service fees, reduced hiring, and potentially lower profits. So what happens? If it's passed, the restaurants would be allowed to pool share tips with cooks, bookkeepers, and other people who don't interact directly with the customers, and that's not allowed under the current rules, and the wait staff could still be tipped. I would say to this, Kwani, as we had a very spirited discussion with folks as we were eating bread in the NBC 10 cafeteria area.
To be specific.
Yeah, to be specific. This is not only do your research, not only look and read stuff, but go talk to the bartenders, talk to the waiters, talk to the people who own establishments,
the managers as well,
and see what they have to say. Because again, some of these questions, and again with the Lyft, with the drivers, if you're in an Uber, talk to the driver and ask what they think about it. It's always good to talk to the people who are directly impacted by this. With the MCAS question, if you know any educators
or parents,
talk to them, ask them what their take is on it, because they sometimes don't, and then you can check and see if what they're saying is true.
Yeah, of course, it's
because sometimes we don't always know what we're talking about, even me. So just verify that it matches what they say would happen. But again, this is another big deal.
I think all 5 of these questions, to your point, also highlight the fact that there's a lot of empathy involved when you think about voting here. Really in general, because even thinking about political parties, a lot of times we'll vote based off of our own interests and not understand how, yes, this one person may affect you financially, but how does it affect the greater good of our country? Which, again, this is idealistic, but it's one of those things where you should at least consider how your vote does affect people around you, especially, for example, with the tipping one. I'm not a waitress, or a bartender, but how will this affect the bartenders and their livelihoods?
It's also what kind of state do you want? What kind of Commonwealth do you want, right? So we boast a lot about Massachusetts, but this is an opportunity for you to say, this is the type of state I want to live in. I want to live in a state that supports this or doesn't support this, is for this or is against this. This is your opportunity to actually craft the laws that our Commonwealth follow. And it will impact when people say, oh, I want to live in Massachusetts, because they don't or they do.
Exactly.
So that's what this is.
Well, Sue O'Connell, I appreciate you giving us some time. This was a crossover of Kwani Has Questions meeting At Issue. Make sure you check out At Issue.
It's a collab.
A collaboration.
A collab.
Especially leading up to the election on November 5th. So appreciate your time. And, of course, stick with NBC 10 Boston for the rest of your political coverage right here in the Commonwealth. Thanks for watching.